Hello, everyone, and welcome back to yet another Game for Thought live stream. My name is Allie Weiss, and I'm a community manager here at Howest Hogeschool's Campus for Digital Arts and Entertainment. We're super happy to have you here, whether you are from DIE, whether you are just a passerby on Twitch. We're really excited to have you back for our fourth stream of the academic year. So for those of you who haven't joined us for a previous stream, no worries. I'm going to give you a brief overview of what this series really is all about. So Howest's Campus for Digital Arts and Entertainment, we are primarily a game art, game development school. And so in the game industry, in this film industry, we're training technical artists, and sometimes the curriculum is very technical, and it's sometimes easy to lose sight of the more socially, ethically relevant topics, like the one that we'll be covering here tonight, which is ethics, AI, and the progress of technology. So we decided to open a space here on Twitch so all of us can come together and really have a meaningful, mature, and nuanced discussion about some of these topics. And so that's what we're doing here tonight. Thank you for joining us. Joining us this evening, we will have a guest presentation from Dr. Bika Zaman from KU Leuven. She is an associate professor of human-computer interaction. We will also have moderating our panel discussion Robin Rodet. Robin is our visual effects major coordinator here at Digital Arts and Entertainment. And additionally, on our panel, we will have Carlos Santos, who is a professor and a research coordinator at Breda University of Applied Sciences. And we'll also have Dries Derekera, who is our game graphics production major coordinator, again, right here at Digital Arts and Entertainment. We have two students that will be joining us as well on the panel, so we'll definitely get their input. We have Milan Dirick. He is a second-year game development student. And we also have Quentin Basten, and he is additionally a second-year game development student. So what are we going to do here tonight? We're going to start off with a presentation by Dr. Bika Zaman about, again, ethics, AI, and the progress of technology. Then we'll take a little bit of a break, and we'll head right into really the meat and potatoes of this stream, which is the panel discussion. So we'll first cover some of the pre-submitted questions that you guys sent in, and then we'll head on over to the Twitch chat, where you are, by the way, welcome to submit any questions at any time in the chat during this evening. Just make sure that you put a Q before your question, so we make sure that it's a question for our panel. I'll collect them, and I'll send them right along to our moderator, Robin Rodet. So without further ado, again, thanks for being here. I would love to welcome Dr. Bika Zaman. Bika?
All right. My screen should be loading right now. Can you see and hear me? All right. Super cool. Let me now share my screen because I have a presentation for you. Yes. All right, thank you. I would like to invite you to join me in reflections on invisible computing. So indeed, as Ali already said, I'm Bieke Zaman. I'm an associate professor at KU Leuven. I have a background in communication sciences, and I do research in the realm of human-computer interaction. And as Ali said, like the Twitch chat is open all the time. And I would like to invite you to already join us in discussions right now. It's not because I'm talking that you cannot join the reflections. So in order to steer the discussion and kick it off, I have a statement for you. And the statement is the following. I will show it on the slide. My statement is, a good tool is an invisible tool. An invisible tool does not intrude on your consciousness. You focus on the task, not the tool. So my question is for you, do you agree or do you disagree? And you can put it on the chat. And I'm having a look right now on the chat, what kind of answers come in. Feel free. So my question for you is, when you look at this statement, would you agree or do you disagree? And what are the reasons? Right. See some agree. All right. Any other thoughts? Reasons why you would agree? You can still join us. So you see here on the slide, there is a statement. A good tool is an invisible tool. Do you agree? Okay, some nuances. Depends what a tool is made for. All right. Okay, whether it's for fun or for other things. Depends on the task. If it's invisible, how do you see it? Okay. You can still continue and add some new thoughts for you, but I have to make a confession right now because I start saying that I have a statement for you, but this statement is not mine. This statement is actually a statement from Mark Weiser, who said these words in 1991. And he was arguing at that time for invisible computing. And he wrote a very influential piece entitled The Computer for the 21st Century. I do not expect you to read it right now, but I want to show you yet another quote of Mark Weiser. And that's the following. The most profound technologies are those that disappear. They weave themselves into the fabric of everyday life until they are indistinguishable from it. So you see here, he is arguing in favor of invisible computing. He's really pro. However, I would also like to show you some downsides. Like what are the pros, what are the cons when we talk about invisible computing? And I also see on the chat that you are kind of nuancing, depending on the situations, what kind of environment we're talking about. And really, there are different lenses to look at invisible computing. So you're definitely right. Continue the conversation. And what we also can wonder is when we're having this debate, we can have and ask ourselves different questions. And there is also something like, what is a good question to ask about it? And it depends, and we've seen some kind of shift in the type of questions that have been addressed in terms of talking about invisible computing and computing altogether. Before the 80s, the main questions with regards to human-computer interactions revolved around efficiency, performance, effectiveness. However, this has quickly changed, and there were other questions that were being asked somewhere around and after the 80s. And those questions revolved more around human values such as fairness, appropriateness, privacy, meaningfulness. And I just want to give a very recent example of that. We're all sitting here together at a safe place and safe distance from each other because we are in the midst of a pandemic. And so there is this kind of Corona app, which can help us to keep healthy. But there have been lots of debates about the Corona app. And to some extent, these debates have been touching upon its invisible nature, because as long as you're not affected, this Corona app is installed on your computer and runs into the background. So many public debates have revolved around issues of privacy, political aspects, social aspects, risks of discrimination even. And not only effects at the moment that when we're using it, we see that these human values have also been at the core of design decisions. So what I did was I had a look at the documentation on the Corona app, the version which is used in Belgium, the more European, decentralized approach. And what I noticed was that these values are central. So even though to some extent it is somehow an invisible computing app, it is built around values of security, privacy, an attempt of avoiding centralized surveillance, keeping control in the hands of the people who use it, and adhering to a level of proportionality. So these are all human values. These are not technical aspects, but these values have driven design decisions. And this is something that I would like to use as kind of a frame of reference, not just asking these effectiveness questions or usability questions, but more the social, the ethical aspects of invisible technologies. And in the remaining of my presentation, I will focus on 5 critical lenses in order to open the debate on invisible technologies. First of all, I would like to talk about the invisibility dilemma. And now I want you all to be really honest. We all like some invisibility, I think, because that's convenient, that's just efficient. When I'm now giving my presentation, really, I don't have the bandwidth to know and find out every single step and transaction that is now currently happening behind the scenes. I trust my machine right now, and I trust that you can hear me well. Otherwise, Ali would call me and say, hey, Bieke, there is something wrong. So there is some kind of trust, and I just have an interface where I see just enough to give my presentation, and I'm comfortable with that. However, the opposite is also true. When I engage in social media, when we're now joining in the Twitch event, etc., we might be wondering what happens with our data. And when it's unclear what happens with our data, or we have an indication that what happens with our data, for instance, is not fair, or what we can do online, then we start critiquing when there is a lack of visibility. And this goes with mistrust. So when we think and consider invisibility or visibility, it's really a matter of finding that sweet spot between, to some extent, some level of invisibility and also some level of visibility. The second lens that I would like to launch is related again to Weiser's quote. And so remember the statement in the very beginning. It was a statement by Mark Weiser, 91, and he was promoting invisible computing or calm computing. Computing that is so embedded, so fitting, and so natural that we can use them without thinking about them. However, we've seen in more recent literature some critiques about calm computing. Because actually, when we do that, we start focusing on the technology and making the technology and the environment smart and proactive. But it's keeping us dumb. It's reducing the speed for us. It's reducing the need for us to think for ourselves. So this idea of calm computing and invisible computing should be counterbalanced. Why not designing technologies that are exciting, stimulating, even provocative, causing us to reflect upon things and the way we interact with technologies? Thirdly, I have the following statement for you. The more technology becomes invisible, the less visible people and the practices are. Let's turn it around. Imagine that we're making technology more visible. What would then happen? First of all, we would make the people visible. That is, we would give people the means to reflect, making their situated knowledge and their design in use visible. What is this design in use? Well, it's the idea that when we're using technology, we're not just using it as passive consumers. We're shaping it. We're giving it meaning. And what a particular app, for instance, for you means is not necessarily the same for me. And we might use it in a creative way, hack a system, or even use it in ways that the designers have never anticipated. Secondly, by making technologies visible, we also make the design more visible. And that implies that we reveal the diversity of implementations. For instance, when we consider AI, it would prevent us from just talking about AI as it is just one thing or even humanizing it. But then it would show us the different AI implementations and how they might differ and how these different choices might have different implications. And thirdly, by making the technology visible, we're also making the people behind the technology visible. And this also comes with issues of responsibilization. if we show who the people are behind the technology, then we can also change the narrative. I think many of you, and we've also seen it in the questions that have been submitted beforehand, we saw these kind of narratives like, will AI steal our jobs? Or AI is understanding us? Or maybe AI has bad intentions. But when we focus on the people who are behind the system, who have implemented design choices, or the people who change it through use, then we should change that narrative and talk about these people and also make them accountable for what they choose to design for and how this is being implemented. As a fourth element, I would like to talk a bit about disconnection. Disconnection is kind of a trend, and there do exist technologies for it, that is disconnecting from the internet. And then this is typically done and also promoted for the benefit of productivity. So you can focus on your work, you can focus on your study, or for your well-being, because you're so much hooked into systems that you say, like, sometimes I need to get these social media, for instance, at a distance. It's kind of ironic that these disconnection technologies are now being launched by the tech bros, the industry, that is actually part of the problem of the attention economy. And this industry is now also creating the solution. It's saying, hey, we're helping you to disconnect. It's kind of strange because they say, like, here is a technology and now it's up to you. So it's all for us, the individual, the responsibility to download this app, to use it in a proper way. And hey, here goes away the responsibility from the industry, because it's up to us right now. But there is some kind of tricky side effect of this. By reorienting the focus to us and our responsibility to disconnect, we're kind of moving away from what is actually happening. And the industry that is now fixing the attention economy, by launching these disconnection technologies, actually make some behaviors of us that were previously invisible, they make it suddenly visible again. Let me give you an example. One of these disconnection technologies is Xianpo's app. You can install it on an Android phone. And it starts by asking you a question, actually challenging you to do some offline activities. For instance, when you get a question, what is your intention? You might type in, I'm off for a walk. I'm doing some exercises. I'm going to eat with a friend or have a drink with a friend, etc. But all these activities were activities that previously were not monitored. These were not captured in the engagement metrics of the attention economy. And by launching these kind of apps, suddenly new data can be captured. So we're actually feeding it again, and we're feeding the engagement metrics that are so much used in today's data-driven economy. And last but not least, I would like to talk about invisible abuse. And lots of the operations today that are happening through technologies are invisible. Invisible, and because what we are looking at does not change. So the visible interface, so to say, does not change. Let us look around. Maybe you have certain devices in your home that are connected through the internet. Maybe you know someone who has a Tesla car. Or let's keep it a little bit closer to our living environment, maybe. Let's look outside and have a look at, for instance, street furniture. Let's say public cameras. When you look today and when you look tomorrow, they look the same. And so by looking at these visible properties, we infer functionalities. However, these devices, and more devices are, because of the Internet of Things, as it is called, are connected to the internet. So this implies that tonight, maybe, over the air, these systems are being updated without us knowing. So your neighbor with the Tesla car might have a brand new car, but from the outside, it looks the same. And maybe that public camera in your street, which has been installed and which is currently used for enforcing speed limits, maybe tomorrow it can perform facial recognition without anyone noticing. So there are many invisible operations happening right now, and unfortunately, it has led to several scandals. But sometimes it's really subtle, because when we're talking about design and design technologies, there are many decisions that are taken. And these decisions, in one way or the other, whether it is a conscious or an unconscious act, they do reflect values and practices. And I would like to give you an example of how values actually steer design decisions. And staying in the context of cars, I will give you an example of self-driving cars. So at MIT, they have created a kind of moral machine. It's kind of a game, but it's a game that invites you to reflect on the ethics with respect to the machine learning intelligence underlying self-driving car. So how does it work? It presents you with several social dilemmas, and I'm showing one on the slide. And every time you have to think of a scenario where an unavoidable accident will happen. And you have to choose. You have to instruct the car what to do. Either the car must hit pedestrians, or in this case, dogs, or the car must harm its passengers. What would you do? This is a hard choice, and it becomes even harder when you think about, for instance, two scenarios, choosing between children and adults, or choosing between 5 or 4, or choosing between. They also bring in status. They really want to see, like, how are we making judgments? And imagine this is happening. What would a self-driving car do? How do we have to program it? And it's a crowdsourced initiative, so you can join it, and your data is being collected for research purposes. So they have already published some first findings. And there we could see that in general, people have some kind of decision heuristics. And one of these heuristics, and I think most of you might have similar heuristics, is that the sheer number of lives matters. So if you have a scenario between 1 versus 10, then I assume that you might also have chosen that it's better sacrificing 1 passenger, for instance, than 10 pedestrians. Also, what these findings have shown is that people in general want cars to be as pedestrian friendly as possible. But it's also somehow a little bit tricky, because people are not really consistent in their judgment, because they kind of change their minds when it comes to their own car and when they are driving the car. And then we see that people are in favor of cars that sacrifice the occupants, as long as they're not driving the car themselves. Because in that case, people want their own car to protect themselves at all costs. So this example was one where we see that values do shape design decisions. But when we talk about design, it's not only when it's really being built. Sometimes design continues, and very often in AI applications, design continues after the implementation. So it's launched on the market. And even when all things seem very ethical at the design time, it might become problematic at the moment that it's being launched and further shaped at that moment. And there is one example that I would give of this problematic and unethical design in use, as it's often called, and that is the chatbots, the Microsoft chatbot Tay, which was designed for good reasons to learn from interactions with real people in Twitter. However, in less than 24 hours, it turned into a racist, sexist, and homophobic personality. So again, what you see here, the design is not only reflecting values, but also reflecting existing practices. And then we have to look at how we as a society already function. And if, for instance, there are current practices of, for instance, discrimination, if that is taken as a basis to train our systems, then these systems will become problematic as well. And here, and I've especially looked for an old article to show that this is not new. This is an article published in 1988, and it shows a scenario where a medical hospital school is automating parts of their admission workflow. So they received many applications, and beforehand they had to screen them manually to decide who we will select to take part and invite them for the interview. And they thought that first part, that manual selection to see like who is good enough to ask for the interview, they thought, let's automate that. But in doing so, they trained a program to adjust the weighting it gave to different criteria, and they relied on previous years' admissions data sets. And actually, in doing so, it replicated the discrimination that was already being practiced by the human selectors. So the program had learned to discriminate against non-white female applicants and people with postcodes betraying their working class backgrounds. And now we might say, hey, that was in 1988, that doesn't happen anymore. Unfortunately, there are recent examples. 2018, big firm Amazon's recruiting engine was also trained based on the company's data set of about 10 years of hiring practices. And this way, it taught itself that male candidates were preferable, and this way, it taught itself to discriminate against women. So even more current AI systems have reinforced biases that exist in everyday practices and existing data sets. What can we learn from that? Well, although these biases are not necessarily made with malice, we have known for more than 30 years that they exist. And just this observation is foregrounding ethical concerns of responsibility by distinguishing between unintended versus unanticipated. We might say that it is unintended, and often this word is being used to stop the debate, because they say, hey, we didn't want this to happen. But then we should ask the question, was it unanticipated? Could this have been anticipated? And there are ways to try to avoid it and minimize harm. For instance, by looking at hiring diverse teams who are making the technologies, by looking at training data and see whether they are representative of the communities that it may impact. So there are ways of doing that. And it's important to see what can we avoid and to take responsibility to try to anticipate what might happen. So I have been bringing you back to 91, to the text, the seminal work of Mark Weiser, The Computer for the 21st Century. Mark Weiser is today considered as a father of UbiComp, ubiquitous computing. And this really came with this article, The Computer for the 21st Century. And this article has a lot of influence today. For instance, in academia, I will show you in a minute, a slide from a quote from a recent publication published in 2019. It was a publication all about human-computer interaction grand challenges. And what these authors said and observed was that interactions in smart environments and ecosystems will become more implicit, often concealed in the continuum between the physical and the digital. So again, they're hinting upon what invisible computing. And this is not only happening in academia, also in the discourses in industry, for instance. And here I will take an example of a very influential person, Eric Schmidt, in 2015, executive chairman of Alphabet Google. And he was speaking at the World Economic Forum in Davos. And there he said the following: the internet will disappear. There will be so many things that you are interacting with that you won't even sense it. So it's still very dominant in recent discourses. So my takeaway for you is that we, in one way or the other, we see many discourses still today that reflect Weiser's ideas on invisible computing and that are promoting that idea of invisibility and calm computing. However, with my 5 critical lenses, I hope I've shown to you that a critical debate on the social and ethical aspects of invisible computing is much needed and is still very relevant today, given the proliferation of AI systems and the Internet of Things. So I hope my presentation gives you food for thought to join the debate. I thank you for your attention, and I think it's now time to make my presentation invisible and put the discussion and you all in the spotlights. I thank you.
So I was just explaining that all the talented moderators couldn't make it today, so you'll have to do it with me. And fortunately, I'm joined by some actual intellectual people. We have Bieke Zaman, who you just had the pleasure of hearing speak. We have Carlos Santos, we have Milan Dierik, we have Quentin Bastin, and we have with me in the studio, Dries de Rijkere. I'm going to just fly straight into this conversation with a very general question. AI, good or bad? What do we think? What's up with that debate?
That is a very generic question.
Yeah. I can hook into that.
Go for it,
if you
Dries.
want me to. So I think it's important to distinguish between what people understand usually under AI and what currently exists as AI, because you have AI as sometimes when we talk about AI, a lot of people think about like Terminator, where there's like a robot from the future with an artificial intelligence, because it's in the name intelligence, versus what we have nowadays is not really intelligent. It's more an algorithm. It's kind of like you would say that a math function is intelligent. So is AI good or bad? It depends on what it's used for and what the intention of that AI is. It's like saying, is a math function good or bad? That's my opinion, at least.
All right. So anybody else that wants to contribute to this, that has an opinion on this?
An AI systems, as a traditional AI, in terms of having computer thinking, feeling, experiencing, we are still quite away from that. So if that's what you mean in terms of AI, and then the definition of AI needs to be important. It is important that, like we were describing, it can be, that can be perceived as even the essence of what an AI agent is, would be alive or not. So it then becomes very personal question, because then you can say, are humans good or bad? Because that answer also is not very well defined. If you want to describe AI, like Reese was saying, of what exists now, again, it's a very much closer to the creator or the person that is designing or developing that AI, that defines if it's good or bad. It's the same thing as any other technology, right? So it becomes a bit close to what the design purpose of that system becomes in terms of what the intended objective of that design is. So for me, that has to be directly linked to not if the AI is good or bad, but the person behind it, his intention is good or bad. So that's something a bit more different to discuss, I imagine.
To give it a good metaphor, I think would be AI is just a tool, right? If I invent an axe, I can use it to chop down trees, which I can use to fuel warmth in my house, but I can also use it to kill someone, right? And that's doesn't make the axe good or bad. It makes the user of the axe good or bad.
All right. So there's certain rules then I can understand when it comes to the creation of these AIs. Who defines those? Is it just the creator itself, or are there some overarching rules when it comes to AI?
Is that a question for me again?
Well, it depends. Anyone that wants to take this question can.
I can. There is clearly some aspiring rules in terms of AI, which is being quoted in some movies and stuff like that. the fact is, it becomes very close to ethics, and ethics per se are cultural. So there are different. The ethics of 200 years ago are not the same as the ethics that we have now. So it becomes very in nature of humans again to define a bit what their goals are in terms of AI. I think there is not an ethical board that defines AI at the moment, and that's, I think, the main concern over people. But I'm not sure if that's actually going to be solving the main issues on this.
All right, Beke?
Yeah, I would like to comment, first of all, on the first question that you launched. I'm not a believer of AI, is it good or bad? Because in my presentation I said there is no such thing as AI in general. So I like that gradually the discussion also gradually focused on the people behind the AI and also in kind of the system in which it is embedded. I think that's important to see because there are many facets in general, not only AI, but technologies. We have the people who use it and who might use it in different ways. We have the people who design it with certain intentions. But then we also have kind of the people more at a macro level who decide upon the governance of these technologies, and the cultural sphere in which it is embedded. We're here now streaming all from a European country, which comes with totally different values when we compare it to the two big other clusters, that is the Silicon Valley, people with totally different values, especially when it comes to the involvement of government. And the same goes for what's happening in Asia. And I think with Europe, we're somewhere in between, and we have our particular value data set, which is really important. And if I'm not mistaken now, at the European level, they're making these values more explicit. So they're working on a more ethical framework to consider AI and values and what are unique to some extent European values that are at stake. And this might help the designers to do a similar exercise as I've shown in my video with the Corona app, that it's first deciding on what are the values at stake, what do we want to realize, and then comes a translation, the act of translation. And that is yet another challenge, because you've seen like these values as I presented for the Corona app, but the way you achieve that or try to pursue these values through design is really a matter of translation. And it's just like when you're building a house, no matter how many things you're specifying, it's really when you're building it that all these small choices have to be made, and these can have big impact and big repercussions. And the same goes for these translations of values. There are millions of ways of how to translate it, and there comes in the difficulty. And that's also the reason why we cannot just say like AI systems in general, but they have different ways of how these things are being implemented.
All right. So there is not really an AI out there right now. It's just the people behind them that drive their values, that drive what the AI does. That is what's going on with AI right now, is what you're saying.
Yeah, and the difficult thing is that often we are not aware of these values. And that also brings in this discussion around intentions, because I do believe that most of the technologies, the majority of technologies are launched with good intentions. But if you're working in a particular economic sphere, like for instance, the Silicon Valley companies, they are driven to make money, neoliberal logic is there. It shapes like the way you look at what is success and what can be quantified and seen as success. So yes, there are people involved, and as you're part of a culture of particular practices, that is being reflected in the decisions that you're making.
Now, sometimes people, when they hear the word AI, and that's something we've addressed a little bit, what AI actually is and how we should understand AI, sometimes people are scared of this sort of rogue program that goes beyond the control of the creators, right? Is that an actual fear we should be having right now? Is that actually something to do with AI right now? I see that Quinton wants to reply.
If I remember correctly, it was Google who at some point made two AIs communicate with each other. And at some point, they developed their own language, and it got to a point where it wasn't understandable for humans anymore. They just swapped out words and found a more efficient way of communicating. And so I guess they kind of went rogue, but that's about the worst that will happen up until now, because machine learning, and if it's very, very advanced, people are kind of scared to give them a lot of options with things they can do. But there's also not a lot of applications yet where machine learning is like really, really useful, like for us as a society, I think, at least.
Bieke?
I like this topic because we've always been scared of new technologies, and that's always been true. You know that once we have been scared of the advent of the radio, and then there were all over the news, there were like these kind of newspapers like, oh, what would it do, and how would it destroy our health and whatever. And then we've been scared of a bicycle, we've been scared of then the television came in, and then all our kids would be addicted of television. And then we're having many game lovers here in the audience. Then the games came in, and now it's AI, and we tend to have these strong emotions when there comes these new technologies. So I think the same goes here. We really have to talk, what are we talking about? Again, what kind of systems, in what kind of context, in which scenario? So it needs to be specified, and at all terms we should avoid being scared, because this comes together with media panics, and there just should be a little bit of smoke and everyone sees a bushfire.
Yeah, I think that really ties into also, for example, 5G and people putting 5G antennas on fire or thinking COVID comes from 5G, which makes zero sense if you look a little bit deeper than that. But I think it's inherent nature of humans to be afraid of what they don't know or don't understand. I think it's really important for people to realize that an AI is nothing more than an algorithm that just takes a bunch of ones and zeros, does something with them in a black box, and spits out a bunch of ones and zeros. And we can push it to spit out other ones and zeros if we use a fitness value and bias it a bit. But in the end, like, people are sometimes afraid of things like, it's going to detect cats, for example. But what if I give it a car? Is it going to detect a car, or how does that work? No, it's just, it doesn't even know, the algorithm, what a cat is. A mathematical formula doesn't know or think anything. It just sees a bunch of ones and zeros, and it outputs a bunch of ones and zeros that says it's a cat or it's a dog. But inherently, it has no concept or idea of what any of this means. So that, I think that's a really important distinction that a lot of people don't seem to realize. A lot of people seem to think that AI has a certain form of intelligence, but it doesn't really. It's just a computer algorithm. And I think that's something that a lot of people don't understand yet when they're talking about AI.
Yes. Go ahead.
I'd like to make the example of GPT-3 here.
Yes.
It's basically the AI framework that can do a lot of stuff. It can create simple websites, designs, it can design forums. You can have pretty solid conversation with it. And people like to ask these questions like, do you want to destroy humanity and whatnot? And I feel like GPT-3 can give pretty solid answers to that. But still, people get genuinely upset because this technology exists. And I think, like the others mentioned already, this stems from just the people don't really know what this technology is.
Yes.
They don't understand it. It is new, and people are, yes.
So Milan, let me interrupt you for 1 second for us non-intellectuals here. What is the thing you're talking about here? Because this GPT-3.
GPT-3, yeah.
GPT-3.
Yeah. GPT-3 is basically, I think it's fair to say that it's the pinnacle of AI research right now. It's a framework that can consume a lot of data, and I mean a ton of data, and
Basically
it can
trained
work
on
with
the
that
internet.
data. Sorry?
It's basically trained on the internet.
Yes.
It's used
And
a lot
it can
in
do
data.
pretty much anything with the data that it's given. It can translate text, it can convert text, for example, you give it some basic rule sets, and it converts that into legal text, basically, and all that kind of stuff. So the more data you feed it, the more it can do.
And I like that you brought up
That's what it comes
the
down to.
fact that you can have conversations with this AI framework. What a lot of people don't seem to realize when they have conversations with GPT-3 is that this AI algorithm is literally just taking a look at what has been said during the conversation and tries to add text to it that looks natural to us humans. You have to understand that GPT-3 doesn't know what you said or doesn't understand what you said. It just tries to naturally follow up the conversation. It's not like GPT-3 doesn't know what facts are. It can lie and it can be wrong and it can contradict itself sometimes. So I think that's a very important distinction that people sometimes see when they see these demos of people chatting with GPT-3. It looks super convincing and real, but that's because it has been trained for us to feel convincing. But in the end, it doesn't think or know anything. And I think that's an important distinction to make.
See, I understand where you're coming with that, but then I hear Bieke saying, oh, we shouldn't be too afraid of that technology. Mm-hmm. But then when you explain this, that does actually sound like something that could potentially be terrifying. Something that knows how to lie to us, knows how to maybe make us feel comfortable in whatever environment it is, but doesn't know that it could cause harm like that. Doesn't know that it could lie us or trick us into something.
Well, you use the word know a lot, but the algorithm doesn't know anything. It just it extrapolates from the data that it was given and gives new data from that data that was given. So it just extrapolates. That is what it's good at. But what you could do is take GTP3, for example, and train it to sell cars. And every time it finds the correct version of words to tell a person, that it convinces that person to sell a car, it could remember and say like, okay, this is a good data set, this is a bad data set. I used these words and it didn't sell that car. And I personally do think that if you train that algorithm and you give it a lot of data, after a while, it might become very deceptive or might become very good at tricking or making us believe that we should buy this car. But I think we're not there yet at that stage of AI.
This is the biggest challenge with AI is that the AI might be biased and we don't know about it. The challenge of, for example, social media is a good example, right? The fact that you have a costume-made feed on your page that is tailor-made for you creates an inherited AI system behind it that is trying to not inform you, but just try to cater for your time. And this is where GPT-3 or other AI systems like this have a bias problem, meaning that they are not there for supporting your information, enriching your information. They're just catering there for your time or whatever subsystem or intention they had behind. For example, selling a car. So they might be inherently be good on one thing, which you might have a persuasive aspect, which we study a lot in this on persuasive technologies, and might direct the audience, which isn't aware of this effect, to a specific gap or a specific direction. And that is the main problem that it might have. And it has already some consequences. We can see, for example, the Cambridge Analytica big scandal that they had. It was an AI system that was trained on massive amount of social media data, which we're able to then tailor-made messages to guide people in different ways. So that's the biggest challenge that we have at the moment, is to make sure that we create fair and unbiased systems that allow you to have a visibility as we have now. We came out from a region. So if you look historically, it came out from a very if you look in like 19th century, when the books starting to become massive and you start having information to be available to everybody. You have a big boom in terms of knowledge and in terms of the physics, the chemistry, etc. Because of the books that be available, and that information was cheaply available for people. Then we went to a radio and TV where the massive information was debited to people, right? But this has still a common vision on things, right? So they still portrayed like although there's a TV and there's multiple channels, there's still like a uniform message to the people. And we start seeing some cultural difference in countries. So we see like the Asian countries and the US countries, and like Bika was saying, that we still have this idea. But now we're even seeing that this segmentation that we start seeing on a country level, or we were seeing on a country level now, is becoming factoring in our country society. We can start seeing, for example, the US, the liberalism versus the Democrats and stuff like that. That's starting to become a big split. The same thing in Europe. We start seeing some more radical ideas that are becoming. I'm not saying this is because of the AI. I'm just saying that this is because of the persuasive nature that some of these bias algorithms may have. Because we're starting to see a bit of our feeds, our vision of tunnel vision of what we see around us. And this is the biggest challenge we're facing with AI, is this nature, or this inability to understand that there's an algorithm behind it, that it might provide information on a tunnel vision, and you should not just fully trust on that information. You should be taking a bigger picture aspect out of this. So that's, for me, the biggest challenge at the moment with AI. It's not about if it's going to be taking control over the world. It's about how is this AI systems is directing us in different ways, but also has a good sides of it, right? So sorry, I'm taking over a bit more, but for example, that allows us to specialize, to become more inaccurate, more tailor-made information on specific topics that we would really like, and then you can get a bit more. But there needs to be a balance there, and I think that balance is still missing.
Mm-hmm. Because, yeah, sorry, go ahead.
Go ahead, Neil.
Well, how would you propose to make these unbiased data sets? Because I would argue that every person, you and me and everyone here, has some inherent bias. How do you eliminate this from the training data sets they want to use for AI?
Bika?
I think it already starts by having diverse teams who are looking at the data. Because what we see is that many of the teams that are looking at it tend to be middle class, often men, white people. And so if we look at more diversity in the team, then we will capture more sensitivities. Will that be waterproof? I don't think so. But having diverse teams is a first step in doing so.
I think the first step there is to be conscious of this. Okay, that will be the first step. Yeah, that we know, being aware that, and not only us being aware, it's not only us aware, but the public being aware of this. Yes, okay, exactly. And to not like. We see fake news all the time, and this is also a bit of that, right? So people, and the flat Earth movement is a thing now. All right, so this is tunnel vision coming to an extreme, and this is where I think that we need to come to understand that people have to look into a bigger picture. Always is not only going for that tunnel vision mode, and that's I think something that we need to be aware of, basically. And that's the conscious, and knowing that being the fact is one point. Then we have to look into the next point, which is, okay, how are we going to solve this? How can this be better? And like Bika was saying, having a cross-cultural aspect of teams, understanding it's a big factor on this.
Bika?
I think linked to this are also questions in terms of responsibilization, like who is responsible for being sensitive, for trying to anticipate on that, for having these checks and balances in the procedure of doing so, because people can be aware of it, but we should not only realize when it's too late. So how to build in some of the mechanisms and also make people responsible for doing so and for the consequences that it might have. I don't have the answer to that yet, but I would like to add in the row of things that are here at stake.
I'd like to comment on the thing that you said during your presentation. I really like the fact that you made a difference between unanticipated and unintended. I really like that you brought that up because it is indeed very important that you need to think about the possible consequences of whatever you're making, and that's not just for AI, that's for any tool that you might make.
It's actually interesting because I've been teaching for about 25 years, more or less, and it's more and more embedded even on our curriculums, that aspect. So we are teaching our students now, master students, bachelor students, to ethically think about things and their consequences of their work. When I was doing my studies 30 years ago, that was never the case, right? So this is something that is also culturally starting to be passed on to next generations. We see that need.
And I think it's also mainly because of the globalization of our society, right? We are more connected than ever because even now during COVID, right? Because we live online almost, where jobs have become online have become online processes. So you have to think about indeed the ethics and the way that you the consequences that your actions might have, not just online but with the tools that you make and the work that you do.
It's interesting that Carlos is also making the link with education, and because it's also kind of the spirit of why this stream has been launched, and why also we're inviting many other students, not only students from DIA, to join this. Indeed, I think it's important to have the next generations of students being sensitive for these issues, because they will shape our future. So people in the audience, you are our future. So it's great that you're here. But I see that these discussions are already internationally going on. So I've been picking up here and there some discussions like thinking about a new job description which has certain labels, for instance, like design ethicist, or I've also seen discussions where they label it design owner, and that's really meant to have someone in a company from the very outset who is joining the engineers, the developers, maybe even also the legal department, etc., to really think about these ethical and social aspects. But so far as I know, there is no one single educational program that is bringing forth these kind of job profiles. So it's really a matter of whatever you have as a disciplinary background, his students in the audience, it's really learning this while you go along and linking it to your disciplinary background, whether what his background is, whether it's more in games, whether it's more in social sciences, in business, in economics, in law, whatever your background is. I think there can always be that ethical reflection that is of interest here.
All right. So AI is there for the betterment of our society. Is that the general consensus that's ruling right now among the people who know what they're talking about, or not?
Well, I think that's the intention of it anyways. It might not always work out that way, but I believe that the intention is to better things and advance them.
So I have a question from one of the people that send in questions for this stream. They are concerned that AI systems are going to make our environment smart. You know, we have these smart homes. We keep hearing the word smart in front of everything. But will they then also make the people dumb? Dries?
I think that it's important to distinguish about, because I do think that AI will make our environments more smarter, but if you take a look at what has been happening nowadays, is we have more information at our fingertips than ever before, right? But that doesn't force us to become dumber. If anything, it forces us to become smarter, because we now have to think more critically than ever to filter out the wrong data, figure out the right data. And I think with the advent of AI, it's going to help us filter that data, but we still have to think critical. And I think it's also part of the 21st century skills, right? Thinking critically and being aware of wrong information and trying to find right information is always going to be a very important skill. And I think it's going to become even more important with the advent of AI, because AI can be wrong. It's not because an AI says something that it's correct. There's probabilities involved.
Right. Yes, Milan, you want to jump in on that? Milan, I think you're still muted in some way, shape, or form.
Yeah, right.
Okay.
I largely agree with what Dries said, and I'm not sure if I have a response to if it makes us dumber or not. But I would argue that it makes us lazier, because AI and AI networks give us all the information that we need without us having to go and look for it. So in essence, yeah, I would argue it makes us lazy, not necessarily dumb.
And we already do this every day, right? When you Google something, there is machine learning involved in the results that you get. So we already use AI almost daily whenever we are researching a topic. And I don't think a lot of people are fully aware of that.
So you're thinking it won't push us down? No, it'll force us to climb up.
Exactly.
All right. Is that Quentin?
I would have to, Dries, you said that it forces us to think critical. But there's loads of people nowadays who refuse to think critical and just believe
Absolutely.
the information that they think to be right.
Absolutely.
So I think there's going to be like a divide among people over time of the people who want to think critical and try their best to filter out the information still by themselves. And there's going to be a group of people who believe what they're being fed and they will separate themselves,
But
I think.
I do want to pick in on that and say, hasn't that always been the case throughout history? There always have been influential leaders that have had large following, and it's not different nowadays. We have flat earthers that follow certain movements. We have people who follow Trump to the ends of the world. So there's always going to be leaders and people that follow them. I'm not necessarily trying to put that in a bad daylight, because I used to bad examples, but there's always people who are going to be more critical, and there's always people who are going to be more lenient to following whatever's being fed to them. And I don't think has to do with the technology surrounding it per se. I think that has been something that has been happening through history, regardless of technology.
Yes, Milan.
Would this maybe be a good moment to start thinking about AI as a tool to think critical about information that is being spread by other people?
I don't know if there's machine learning algorithms that help with fact checking. I don't know if that exists. It would make sense if there's some forms of that out there.
Yeah, there is, and not only they are looking at that, but also things, for example, for checking deepfakes and checking if the videos that you're seeing are real or not real. So there is already in AI systems that look into trying to validate the information you get. But there are sources and sources, and there are sources that ultimately believe in, and even us, we believed on the physics models that we learned from Einstein at the moment, but before we had Newton, and they were disproven wrong, and before it was again, the biggest challenge here is that science is not something that's fixed, it's something that is evolving and always learning. And second of all, our cultural bias, the way we were born, raised, grown, educated by our parents and educated by our society, it has a lot to say about how we deal with the current situation. So you're quite right in terms of Milan, in terms of, and even Quentin, in terms of how does AI makes it a bit lazy, but that is a bit of our nature and our cultural bias coming towards us. So in that respect, I think we have to consider a higher level of looking at things and like Grace was saying, this is something that happened always. It becomes a bit of to which level we should starts interfering with that. And again, we've gone back to ethics. So I think I'm going to be leaving this to others to look at.
I got a fun story, by the way, about the detection of deepfakes. Because they use machine learning to detect whether or not a video, for example, is made with machine learning. But that's using machine learning to detect machine learning. And there are machine learning algorithms out there that can change 1 pixel on an image and make an image of a cat be detected as an image of a turkey, for example, just because it's been trained to subvert machine learning detection algorithms. So I think it's always going to be one step and then another and another and another. And I don't think that's going to be an ending battle. I think it's always going to be out there because if you can train one model to be a little bit better versus another model, then you can train that model to compete against that original model to become better, and so on and so forth. So,
all right. Well, during the course of our whole discussion, we've had some questions from the audience running in. So let's see if we can dive into those. I've got my first question here. I'm reading off the screen for the problems that are currently there with AI. Do those problems lie with the AI developers or with the people compiling the data for the AI? Do we have an opinion?
The training data.
The training data, yes.
That's a difficult one because most of the times the person that are training the algorithms are the same one collecting the data. Unless the sources are also a problem. So it's sometimes is the way the trainees or the AI is trained based on data. Most of the data comes from convenience, from easily accessible or having access to that data in terms of browsing or crawling the internet or getting a data set from a specific source or having crowdsourcing to label the data, and if that label is not correct, etc. Then so it has to do a lot with how the data is compiled and harvested. So that's I imagine that has to do a lot with it. At the moment, the way AI systems are working, the designers of AI has some contribution on how the AI works, but they have mainly relying on the data. So if you have to say something about if the AI is getting good or bad, the quality of the data, it has to do a lot with it, and the amount of data as well.
All right.
The quality of the data is indeed a very important aspect. A fun little example that I saw is they had an AI that was supposed to detect a certain type of fish, and they gave it a large data set and it trained, and it could accurately detect that type of fish. But then they looked at what the AI is actually using to detect what type of fish it was. And they realized that every time they saw the fish that it was supposed to detect, it was looking at fingers on the screen. Because the fish that we're trying to detect was actually a prize fish. And every single one of the pictures that they fed into the data set was someone holding the specific fish. So it wasn't detecting the fish at all. It was just detecting an arbitrary piece of data that was related to what the result was supposed to be. So I think bias will always be in your data set, and I think it's super difficult to anticipate what the AI is actually going to find and how your AI is actually going to break your data set in very unexpected ways sometimes.
Okay. So maybe this is one for Bieke from our audience. The ethics of AI and everything to do with that. How to treat that issue. Isn't that already an issue that's over 50 years old that we're thinking about? Because our viewers are wondering, is it largely based on the writings of Asimov?
It's a difficult question, like how to solve the ethics. It should be part of the debate and on the radar. I think I gave some examples, and I've also seen that there was some discussion on the chat regarding like diverse teams, which can be one way of looking at the proposed technologies and the design technologies from various angles. Other strategies are, for instance, to design with and for the people that are being impacted. In my jargon, it goes with terms like participatory design, but you also have like citizen science endeavors. So participatory design is the idea that when you design a new technology, you involve the people who eventually will be affected by the technology. So if it's a technology to be used at a workplace, then you go, and even before you're conceptualizing it, you're talking to the people, you're looking at how they work, their practices, because we know that what are the current practices, and you make that part of the negotiation. And then you see how and whether technology can play a role in there. Because we've been talking like AI for the betterment, and then the question is, should AI be, or technology per se, be the solution? And what we should avoid at all cost is these kind of solutionisms, discourses, which are, in a sense, we have a problem, and then the answer is, hey, there is an app for that. So it's the fact that for whatever problem we're having, there is an app that will be a solution, or the technology will solve it. And I think whatever strategy we're using, there are various strategies that you can do to have more ethical reflection. I think this part of the discussion should be, is technology the answer? So again, also for 5G, we've been mentioning it here. Actually, before we're thinking like 5G for the betterment, we should first actually focus, what is the problem at stake? And then, do we really need a technology, whether it's AI, whether it's 5G, whatever it is, a good understanding of the problem together with the people who are part of that problem space. I think that is a magical recipe, but again, there are many ways in which you can implement it, and I cannot list them all. I do not have the background to know them all, but it's good to think about what is a problem, is technology part of it, and then if we're thinking of technology, to involve the people who are affected by that in order to have as much as ethical reflection as possible.
So I'm hearing you say involve the people who are affected by the problem you're trying to solve, or that piece of technology is trying to solve. So
Yep.
when it comes to AI and those sorts of things, those pieces of technology we're using to solve something, are those truly the people you believe should have a choice on what the AI should do and how it should do it? Or should it be regulated by a country, a government, a board of scientists with a lot of expertise on the matter?
These are all important stakeholders, and our life is more complex than just the design and the interface and the people who are using it. We are indeed having regulations, we have a government, we have cultural practices. So it is a complex part, but when we're just thinking about even AI systems, I'm thinking of a project which is running right now at my lab, the Meaningful Interactions Lab, and we're looking at how to make online debates more civilized. And we've been looking at what the technology can do, and we've manually also checked like how accurate the AI system is. But for some things, there is like really, you need a human interpretation, and you need insights in human meaning making. For instance, how to interpret something. When we see memes, it can have various interpretations depending on who is the sender, who is the receiver, in what kind of context. And if you're not challenging your data set or whatever interpretations and decisions that you would like to build into the program, if you're not challenging this with the people who are part of the meaning making, then you risk to make wrong interpretations and wrong decisions. So I'm not saying that everyone who is involved in that participatory design should become an AI expert, but they are experts about their own lives. And so that's the way they can contribute.
All right. Yes, Quindo?
I would also like to, the question mentioned Asimov's writings. which are based on like a lot of hypotheticals. And he wrote this rule set, which he calls his law of robotics, which need to like limit what a robot, because then we weren't even talking AI yet, what a robot would be allowed and not be allowed to do. And while it's a very, like, he reasoned in a lot of nice ways about it, but the problems that he then supposed robots would pose are a lot different from the problems we have now and the ethics we need to reason about now in our current situation.
Because indeed his laws of robotics stem from the perception that his robots could reason, right? But an algorithm doesn't reason. It just takes its data set and extrapolates. And if the data set is biased, then his extrapolation is going to be biased. And I think the main gist of the discussion right now is how can we get bias out of those data sets while we live in a biased world? I think that's the biggest problem to solve right now.
Yes, because speaking of that biased world, right now, can we talk about ethical AI when there's no global ethical framework at play? It's maybe a hard question. So yes, Milan.
I would like to compare this to the gambling industry, actually, and the ethics surrounding that. Because right now there are a lot of institutions that concern themselves with the ethics of gambling, but I don't think there's a globalized institution for that. It all depends on countries and governments and local institutions to talk about this and to make rules and regulations.
All right. Anybody else that wants to weigh in on the previous topic, or is that just a bit too big to discuss?
I think it's, in a certain way, I'm not going to say it's irrelevant, but in a certain way a bit too broad, because you can have ethics rulings, and even if you have a global ethics framework for machine learning, I'm pretty sure majority of people who work with machine learning are going to stick to that. But it only takes a few researchers, a few people who just disregard those rules and do whatever to create something new. And whatever can be thought of will be created at some point. So I think having ethics and a global ethics framework is important, but we should also not be naive that there will always be people who just don't care about that kind of thing.
Okay.
Yeah, we have to remember that we don't agree on fundamental rights for life, so abortion is a theme that is being discussed all across different nations. They all have different rulings. So, and if we cannot agree on things regarding that for AI, which is a new topic, which is just been around for the last 20 years, maybe. Remember, 20 years is nothing in terms of time span of a technology. Is very, very, very difficult to argue or discuss or even understand the implications of it. So I think there is still a bit of a long process for us to learn about AI, learning about the bias of it before we actually start doing rulings. That's my take on this. It's just too soon to even start looking at that. The consequences are still not severe, although there is consequences already. I clearly there are, and we need to understand a bit more about what are we talking about here, and that's a premise that we need to look at.
And I think the next question from our audience has a bit to do with that understanding, but more also tying into what Bika was talking about earlier about the understanding of the people about what's going on with AI, what is AI. The fear that you often hear when people are talking of AI or what they imagine AI to be, do you think that has to do with sort of just a general humankind not being able to accept the fast pace of technology out evolving them?
I think that people are always going to be complaining about the technological evolutions. I think there's scripture of people in around the year 100 or something complaining about children reading instead of playing outside. So there's always going to be a technological advancement that's going to be made, and there's always going to be people afraid of it. I think that's just reality. I think it's our job as educators and our job as people who understand the technology to educate as many people as possible and make them understand the technology behind it, because I think most of the fear stems from not knowing how it works or what it can do.
Is that something you agree with, Bieke?
Yeah, I think people don't like uncertainty, and especially people don't like change, because that comes with an effort that you have to put in it. If you have your way of working, whether it's at your job, for studying, and suddenly this change, even though when it's for the good, people tend to, in the long term, people tend to first look at short-term actions, and that means like you have to change things, your habits. And if you're changing habits and practices, that costs a lot of energy, and especially with the uncertainty that comes with it, and then together with these media panics, this isn't creating a climate for people to be likely to take it on.
And the sad thing is the media panics get clicks, and that makes money, unfortunately.
All right. Okay. Another question from the audience is, how can we stop the danger of suggestive AIs? And specifically here, the options given where people start believing in flat earth or anti-vax.
I think that kind of ties into what we talked about earlier with Cambridge Analytica, using a machine learning algorithm to sway elections, or using machine learning algorithms to sway public opinion. I think it's mostly, that's one of the most dangerous uses of AI right now, I personally think. Because AI is really good at taking very large data sets and then extrapolating it into things that work for most people. It's not going to work for all people, but that doesn't matter. It's going to work for most people, and that can be powerful enough to sway elections and can be powerful enough to, for example, have an entire anti-vax movement because they get certain articles on their Facebook page because the algorithm just decides they should see that because that's what they click on. And it feeds back into what they believe and creates a feedback loop, which I think is ethically one of the most dangerous things that these algorithms can do, if we're talking mostly about social media and public opinion.
That was the last question from our audience, at least for now. We still have a little bit of time left. Among you, is there someone that wants to give a message about AI that has a closing thought on the matter based on what we've been discussing so far? Which is hard. I know you need to gather your thoughts for that.
I think, as my personal opinion, humans are tool builders, right? We are really good at building tools. It's what we, as a species, has brought us into where we are now. There was a really cool study that showed the efficiency of movement between different animals. And I think one of the most efficient animals in terms of movement was a certain bird. I don't remember which one. And humans was somewhere like in the lower thirds, really unassuming. And then they added an extra graph on that, and that's a human on a bicycle, which just completely obliterated the best animal in efficiency. So I think that really ties into what humans are really good at. We build tools to advance ourselves, not just intellectually, but also as a society, but also physically, right? And AI is, for me, another step towards achieving a better society. It's all in how we use it. The internet is, for me, one of the biggest changes that has happened in a long time in human history. And I think advancements in AI is going to be, if not bigger than the internet, once we start getting machine learning algorithms that are really good at what they do, and once we start getting actual semblances of intelligence using computers. But I think that's a leap ahead, and I don't think we're there by a long shot yet. But we are, I think, going to get there at a certain time. A lot of people, I feel, are afraid that machine learning is going to remove their jobs, or machine learning is going to get them fired and it's going to replace them, or we're all going to become dumb because we don't have to think for ourselves anymore. Machine learning is something that is evolving, right? It's not like we're going to wake up tomorrow and there's going to be Skynet ruling the world. That's not how it works. It's a very gradual and slow process, and we've been talking about machine learning for 50 years now, and only now are we seeing it integrated into our society. So it's still going to take tens of decades before AI is like going to become as big as the internet, I think. But I think it is on track to go there. I'm not an expert in the field, but if I look at the literature I've read around it, I think that's what we're heading towards.
Okay. A new question came in, and I actually personally love this question because this may be a more fun one to discuss. What do you feel is going to be the biggest positive to come from AI in the next 10, 20 years? Or what do you hope is going to be the next big positive? Yes, Milan.
I think AI could play a big role in making ourselves sustainable on this planet. Because a big thing right now is that we are not living a lifestyle that is sustainable. This is going to end someday unless we do something about it. And the problem is we only have so many smart people that can work on this. So if we can use AI to help us create new technologies and make new predictions about how we can change our lifestyles to make ourselves sustainable, that would be great.
I think the biggest advancement that AI is going to bring in the near future is going to be in the medical field, because a doctor's job, if we're talking about a general practitioner, is reading symptoms and giving advice based on those symptoms. And if you have an AI that has instant knowledge of all the different kinds of medication, all the different kinds of interactions between that medication, and also all the kinds of different diseases, symptoms, and stuff like that, it's going to, I think, critically advance diagnosis of medical situations. It's already being used to detect cancers or other kinds of diseases. So I think the biggest short-term advancements I think we're going to see in the medical world.
Yes, Carlos?
Yeah, so my wish is actually that AI could allow us to be more, support us in being more cultural accepted to each other. I think there is still a big stigma in society, and which AI might be the one causing some of it. But this is a long tradition in history in terms of different cultures fighting among each other. So if I have a wish, is that AI is allow us and is supporting us to teach each other to be more understanding and more supportive of each other in terms of cultures, in terms of religions, and that for me would be the wish for AI, is to be able to break those barriers that we have that distinguish the different races, cultures, and stuff like that, and breaks that would be my wish. If we're going to get there, if we're going to be learning about that while for training AI, or if the AI is going to be able to support us in that role, I don't know, but that would be my wish if I could get one.
All right. Milan, I saw you raise your hand earlier. Was there something you wanted to add?
Yes, I had a question for the example you gave. If an AI misdiagnoses a patient, who is responsible for that?
That's a very, very good question. And I do want to add to that. An AI doesn't have to be perfect. An AI needs to be better than a human, which isn't as hard as you think it is. That also ties into automated driving. Who's responsible? That is a question I can't and won't answer because it's such a very difficult question. Is the maker of the AI responsible? Is the doctor that is overseeing the AI, because having a completely autonomous machine diagnose you, I don't think we're going to be there soon. Is the doctor overseeing it responsible? I think that would be the most likely answer. Is it the patient's responsibility to double check and fact check? That's a bit questionable. But there's a lot of different parts to that question.
I have a different answer for that. Which
Okay.
is you're looking at, okay, yes, if the misdiagnosis, this is a problem. What about all the other times that I got it right and the doctors didn't? So can we balance that? So this is a traditional ethical dilemma, which is, okay, would we accept that 2 people die in detriment that we save 100? So this is something that we have to understand in terms of balance, and it's a moral dilemma. And again, dilemmas in ethics is very difficult to define, but we can always do the other round. Like, what if I say that I have an AI that may fail 1% of the time, but it's 20% better than a doctor? So would you accept that as a patient? And there's a different way of taking things. Yes, you will fail. We know we will fail, but it might be better than the diagnosis of a normal doctor. So it's now it's up to you. Would you accept an AI to treat you with these conditions?
It's a really good point.
Bieke?
Yeah, I would like to go back to your initial question. What is the AI for good? And I think this is an interesting question because it also reveals like which problem is closest at your heart. And I think for me, it's really hard to say which one I would care most about, but maybe it's interesting that we're not the first who have asked that questions. So in 2015, world leaders, so all very important people, have actually agreed upon 17 global goals. And officially, if you Google it, it's known as the Sustainable Development Goals, or often abbreviated as SDGs. And many big institutions, like for instance MIT, take these as prior goals, like when they're launching programs. And the example here, that the examples being given, for instance, good health and well-being, is one of those 17 goals. So we're spot on. We're thinking like world leaders here. But there are also things like quality education, decent work, reducing inequalities, the climate action, peace, strong institutions, etc. So I think this is a nice one to open up the realm of possibilities here now that we're approaching the end. I'm not saying, for me, it's hard to say which one I would prefer and see as a priority. I think they're all really important, and maybe let's see what kind of situations are most demanding and what kind of teams there are to give an answer to that.
So if we do want to go the positive route, we already have our task list laid out for us. That is what we conclude on.
Yeah.
All right. Well, I'd like to thank you all for joining me here tonight to discuss AI, the progress of technology, machine learning a little bit. We went into that as well. So thank you, Bieke. Thank you, Carlos. Thank you, Milan. Thank you, Quinten. And thank you, Dries. Thank you all for watching. This was our 4th Game for Thought stream, and we hope to see you again for the 5th one. Good night, everybody. Bye.
Bye.
All right, and we are back. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining our fourth Game for Thought stream. We so look forward to having you back for our last Game for Thought stream of the academic year on the 22nd of April. For that one, we're going to be tackling the social dilemma. So largely focusing on issues of social media, media literacy, and privacy. So make sure to catch us again on the 22nd of April right here on Twitch. I'd like to give a huge thank you to everyone involved in this evening. Of course, our panelists and our guest speaker, Dr. Bika Zaman, Carlos Santos, Robin, Rode, Dries de Rijkera, and of course, our students, Milan Dierik and Quiston. I'm sorry, Quentin. I now butchered your name 2 times. Quentin Bestant, thank you so much for joining us here tonight. We really appreciate all of your time. And of course, everyone behind the scenes, thank you so much to Sandra, Carlos, Bert, and Luna are our tech experts. Also, Alexander is our sound guy. Thank you very much. And of course, Rick, our Master Chief, thank you so much for making this possible. Just a quick note, I put the link in the chat on Twitch. We'll also put the link on YouTube when this video is ready to roll out on YouTube, which will be tomorrow. There is a Game for Thought podcast on Spotify. So if you are looking back to the previous streams or thinking about this one and some of your questions maybe weren't covered due to time constraints, don't you worry. We have a Game for Thought podcast in which we are covering some of the topics that we did not quite get to. So check out that link. It's on Spotify. The first 3 episodes are available, and the 4th one will be recorded very shortly. So again, thank you so much to everyone involved. Thank you for coming by, and we very much look forward to seeing you all on the 22nd of April. Everyone have a great night. Thank you so much. See you for the next one.